Well, thanks very much for that welcome, Shana. It's great to be yet again back in Belfast, a terrifically vibrant part of our country, a place where I have many very close friends. So I appreciate being invited to this, and congratulations on this endeavour, because there's not much attention to the rising and indeed the Proclamation of Independence after the centennial. This is the single most significant event I'm aware of anywhere. So fair dues for doing that. Also, just for what it's worth, I've supported the Moore Street reservation in writing before the courts, and I also personally endorse the objective of getting a proper fitting memorial to Pádraig Pearse in Dublin City, or anywhere else for that matter. Because even though he is a Dubliner, a quintessential Dubliner, it doesn't really matter where it goes. It could be in Sydney for all I care, but we shouldn't pretend that he's not important. Anyway, moving straight along. I'm going to do something a little bit unusual, which wouldn't be the first time, hopefully not the last, in that I'm going to try and give you here and there, as time permits, something of the authentic voice of Pearse, in other words, Pearse in his own words. So it's not going to be terribly erudite, but it's going to be the authentic voice of the man we've come here to hear about. I'll also give you a brief overview of his biography, because again, I'm assuming no prior knowledge in a room that has many people who are extremely knowledgeable about all these things. So for some, it could be old hat, and for others, hopefully, you'll hear a few things you haven't heard before, and a few points of view that you may not have considered. Well, I suppose the boring bit is he was born on the 10th of November, 1879. Now, that's an important part of our history. That's the generation after An Gorta Mór, the Great Irish Famine, so-called. His own family, on his maternal line, the Bradys, had fled Kildare and indeed the Leinster in general into the city. And often a rise in urban populations at a time of crisis is the first sign of a deep, deep schism in society in the rural parts of our country. The same thing happened in Limerick City. The liberties of Limerick City, the Roxborough area, became highly overpopulated. They weren't allowed downtown, but they're allowed to establish a shanty on the edge of downtown, the metropolitan area. And there's something similar happened in Dublin. Despite the hemorrhaging of our national population across the Atlantic and into the cities of industrialising England, and indeed Glasgow. Now, James Pearse, his father, as many people will insist on telling you, was an Englishman. And the level of emphasis given to the Englishness of his father is an index of the attitude of the historian who's trying to convey a particular view. It didn't matter a jot if he was English or not. What they often don't tell you is he was a published radical. This is a man who was a pamphleteer and an autodidact, as well as a businessman, as well as a public intellectual. So Pádraig Pearse, came from a very interesting family. The Bradys, so the second wife of James Pearse, they were connected to the Fenian Brotherhood and can trace their immediate family heritage back to 1798, the United Irishmen. Again, this city, of course, played a crucial role in developing the early phase of republicanism. So it's not as if Pádraig Pearse became some sort of distracted playwright and found himself accidentally in the GPO and writing radical documents. He was steeped in it on both sides of his family. You can see a trace of that, I suppose, an echo of it, in the fact that when he was still a teenager, he was writing and presenting and publishing speeches on Gaelic Irish society, which is quite phenomenal. It's nearly precocious, but it's a sign that he's coming from this sort of hothouse politicized family. Very interesting people indeed. He went to CBS Western Row, so yes, you can blame the Christian Brothers. It's all their fault. All Ireland's evils can be traced back to the priests and the nuns. Well, I don't think so. He got a very strong foundation in education. We saw him through UCD, where I went myself at one point, where he took a degree in Irish, English and French. And people forget that. He was a fluent French speaker. That became important as he developed his interest in educationalism and was able to travel to Belgium, a country that only existed in 1830, and talk to them in the language of many Belgians, not all of them. He attended King's Inn and Trinity College Dublin, where he became a barrister. He qualified for the bar and was called to the bar in 1901. There's one official account of his life, and I won't go into any great detail, which says he only took one case. Well, actually, he took two, and both of them were linked to his primary interest in this period of his life, which was Conor na Gaeilge, the Gaelic League. Now, at the same time that Sean McDermott, who Brian Feeney will be talking about in a few weeks and is very knowledgeable about, at the same time that McDermott was trying to sort of wrest control or establish a bridgehead for the Irish Republican Brotherhood within the Irish language movement, which in a way was it's a low-hanging fruit in many ways. It's somewhat obvious. Pearse was a staunch advocate of that. And even before he became the editor of Enclave Solace, the main journal of the Irish language people, and incidentally bilingual, which is quite important in its own right, Pearse took two cases defending members of Conor Gaeilge, a man in Donegal and a man in Kildare, who happens to be my wife's great-great-grandfather, Donal Buachla. Now, Donal Buachla played a significant role in 1916, as did his brother Micheál. Micheál was an associate of Cathal Brugha and was involved specifically in the Kilcool gun running, more of which later on. So Pearse was always sort of called towards the flame. He was impelled towards activism. He had that mentality. And there's many people in this room have the same mentality and suffered for it, but also achieved things on that behalf. In 1908, he really made his mark by establishing an experimental school, an incredibly advanced project of Scoileanna Enda's, originally in Cunswood House in Ranelagh. That's on the Ranelagh-Rathmines interface. 2 years later, he sort of, I suppose, attempted to upgrade it, made it a partial boarding school, not entirely boarder, by the way. There were also day pupils in the Hermitages estate outside Rathfarnham. Now, one of the reasons why that estate was meaningful to Pearse was that this is an area frequented by Robert Emmet. Robert Emmet's de facto fiancée, Sarah Kern, had lived across the road with, of course, her famous father, John Philpott Kern. That's a sad old story, I'll tell you right now. Many of you are familiar with it. But the significance of Emmet is quite important. Now, I haven't got much time to talk about that, but suffice it to say, Emmet was the icon of the Fenian Brotherhood. And across the Atlantic, Clan na Gael. And Emmet's birthday and his death dates were always heavily marked. The thing that began to supersede some of that, as well as the Manchester Martyrs commemoration, which was a big deal in the Irish nationalist and Republican calendar, became Easter 1916, right? But you see, there's only so many days you can have a significant event with special gatherings and special speeches and all of that, because as an organisation, you don't want to overdo it. So you have to sort of choose the one that's most relevant to your phase of struggle. So anyway, Pearse was instrumental in ensuring that Easter 1916 is immortalised. So he was, from his early days, despite what some people would tell you, Republican orientated. He was also interested in social history. He was interested in the issues of mankind, and I'll tell you why. If you left his house, it was now Pearse Street, Great Mundra Street at the time, named after one of the internal line of Germans who insisted on being royalty across the water. And God knows how many of them are, the von Battenbergs and God knows what. Anyway, that's their business. And if they keep it to their business, that's okay by me. But anyway, they made it our business. Many of you will know more about the lineages of British royalty than I care to, but fair dues. These days we're moving in a different direction. And so are they, by the way. But that's... if you know what I mean. Scoileanna was a very, very ambitious project. I said, as I mentioned earlier, it was bilingual. Now, most instruction was through Irish, but full immersion wasn't practical. And what he wanted to do essentially was this. He wanted to create an Irish tolerant and Irish qualified middle class. Now, I know that sounds bad, but this is to take over from the British who are running the country. He wanted to create people who would be senior civil servants in the judiciary, managing the affairs of our country in our way, influenced by our culture and not theirs. So to do that, you needed to be bilingual, ideally. But the other things you could do in St. Enda's is you could learn to drive a car. Now, who was driving a car in the 1910s? Only people like some of these families came from. And you have a sort of return diaspora of the Fenian diaspora from as far away as Buenos Aires, and as close, I suppose, spatially as Manchester, and all over Ireland. So he was sort of a hot housing element. And of course, within that milieu, you have a branch of na Fianna Éireann. And you have people who are connected to the Fenian Brotherhood by virtue of being in the NFE. So you can learn how to shoot a rifle as a schoolboy. Later, yes, there would have been some instructions in other more advanced techniques, but don't believe RTE's version of this. That's absolute hogwash. People like Con Colbert from Ataya County Limerick were present to do instruction of a particular nature. Tomás MacDonagh, Sean McDermott, that sort of cluster of Republican intellectuals and activists were unified in the presence of people like Pearse and later James Connolly. And the drawing in of Connolly into the ambit of the IRB which was very firmly in place by 1915, 1916, is something that anyone familiar with this institution needs no instruction or guidance. So from being a cultural and quasi-political figure, largely known as an educationist, he was also a poet of some capacity, it's not up to me to say, and a playwright. And amongst the things they were doing was he was bringing the students to take part in plays in the National Theatre in Dublin inner city. That was progressive. And if you didn't feel like getting on a stage, and I hate being on a stage myself, you could involve yourself in the logistics of theatre. So there's always going to be a role for you. Everyone had a role to play, and you were given an appropriate role. Whatever you were up for or felt comfortable with, that could be accommodated. On the 31st of March, 1912, Pearse did indeed address a Home Rule rally in Dublin City. It's often assumed wrongly, and it's easy to make mistakes because reportage in the history of these times is incomplete, that he shared a stage with John Redmond. It was actually more interesting than that. He shared a second stage with Joe Devlin of Belfast. And if you don't believe me, I suggest we all head down to Kelly Cellar and talk it out. Devlin was an interesting man, because Devlin, of course, was the de facto head of the Irish Parliamentary Support Group in this city. In other parts of the world, the United Irish League fulfilled that role, including from here to Australia, and indeed through all the major cities in the United Kingdom. But in Belfast, it was the Ancient Order of Hibernians, the AOH Board of Erin. Now, the Hibernians in Derry, for instance, would have been staunchly nationalists as opposed to Republicans, and that was also the case in Tyrone, that was the case in Fermanagh. In Belfast, there were muscular nationalists, and the Devlinites saw themselves as a counterweight to loyalism and a counterweight to empire enthusiasm, let's put it that way. Devlin was not someone to be trifled with, and indeed he was a man who was receptive to receiving weapons imported by Oakland and Heron. So people tend to forget that, just because there were rivalries later on that were quite damaging across the country. But Pearse was, at that point, a public figure, largely regarded as, not as a lawyer, as I said, he only took 2 cases. Provisionally he was commended, incidentally. He could have had a stellar career in law if he wished to do so. The case with O'Buachler, for instance, was technically unwinnable, but it went to the High Court and he was commended by the judge who actually had to strike it down on a point of law. And I might as well say this for 2 seconds. What happened was that O'Buachler was using his own name in Irish on his business premises in Maynooth in County Kildare. That was deemed to be a foreign language and unintelligible, because you weren't allowed to have an unintelligible sign if you were in business. Is an Irishman in his own country writing his own bloody name on his house, on his property, and of course on a point of law that could not be upheld because the law was designed to, let's just say, repress that part of our ancient heritage. So Pearse couldn't win it, but he made a good point about it. And to the best of my knowledge, that was the last high-profile case of its nature taken. Now, this is a man who, in the census of the early 1900s, listed himself and all his family and all his workers under their Irish names. So this is a man who lived it. He was a promoter of the Gaeltacht system in Leinster, and he was also a Hibernian, by the way, as was MacDermott, and he was also an early member of Oakland and Heron, and then later a member of the First Dáil, Second Dáil, and a lifelong friend of those who didn't prevail during the Civil War 22-23. But that's a different matter. In January 13, you had the formation of the so-called UVF, and that was a problem because that allowed an extra-parliamentary wildcard exert pressure on those in England who wished to see this as an imperial issue and had no interest in self-determination. They weren't pretending to be Democrats. I mean, we might as well say that. Ireland and Britain were not democracies. There was no great impulse from the establishments of either parts of these islands to encourage democracy. That was left to radicals who were Republicans and socialists and proto-communists and that type of ilk after the 1910s. So there's no question of that. You didn't have one man, one vote. When I was born in '68, most of you didn't have one man, one vote, for Christ's sake. You know what I mean? That took intervention from London to achieve even that small increment of democracy in this part of our country. The creation of UVF, the most significant and salient outcome of that was the creation of Oakland and Heron. The IRB Supreme Council had been preparing since 1907, during the revival phase, which I'll come to in a second, to have some sort of broader, more moderate, more public and legal organisation that they could control. And let's face that, they wanted something they could control, recruit from and direct. The establishment of the UVF, and particularly their quasi-legal armament from Larne and other ports in the following spring, was incredibly useful. You'll be told that Owen MacNeill was singularly effective with his famous essay, The North Began. What you're not often told is Pearse asked him to write it. Pearse asked MacNeill to write The North Began, to suggest that there should be a counterweight reflecting the issues and the aspirations that were presumed to be that of the majority of the Irish people, that had to be untested because there was no way of testing it at the polls. You couldn't do it electorally. There was no constitutional pathway. There was no constitutional pathway to either self-determination, let alone the Republic. Right? So the IRB did want a revolutionary front, and the Ogden Heron was what they got. Now, one of the people who were involved in the secret planning for this, the 11th of November 1913, was Pearse. Now, there's a question about when Pearse was informally inducted to the IRB. Bulmer Hobson is incredibly unreliable on this. I know he's a much respected and revered Belfast man of largely Methodist and Anglican heritage, and he was a very important man. And he is the primary architect in Fianna Éireann, and he did important reform work within the IRB Supreme Council from around, again, 1907, 1908, all the way up to 1916. But he wasn't always in step with those who had a clear strategic view. But he survived, and was in a position to express his views in a way that I do not think are borne up by the facts, taken in context, looked at in detail. So Hobson believed that he sworn Pearse into the IRB. I have an inclination that Pearse was already in the IRB and may have gone along with this. That was to do with his trip to America, which I'll come to in a minute. So Pearse was very much at the centre of things, certainly by 1913. And you can see that the type of journalism he was engaging in appealed to people like Tom Clarke. Now, there's space perhaps down the line for a talk on the IRB, right? But let's put it this way. In 1907, you have the return from exile as an American citizen of Tom Clarke, sent by John Devoy. You have the return of Pat McCartan of East Tyrone, a place that never failed to be not involved, always involved, from Philadelphia as an agent of Joe McGarity. And they both went back, McGarity went back on other occasions. You have Dennis McCullough rising to the Premier League of the IRB. You have a willing sort of agent on their behalf, the front man, Owen MacNeill, who is an Irish language lecturer in UCD. You have Dermot Lynch, the single most senior Fijian not to be executed in 1916. Dermot Lynch crossed the Atlantic on multiple occasions. You have people who are heavy movers, prime movers in the Irish revolutionary tradition, and they co-opted Pearse. And by the spring, they started by May 1915, Pearse was on the military committee. Now, the military committee is a very interesting idea. It's sort of close to thinking what we used to be called the triangle, the top three-man leadership of the Plan de Gael organization in America, which was the sister organization of the IRB here. They were intimately connected, and they're connected in a way that's not appreciated in modern Irish historiography. I'm asserting that. I mean, I don't have time to go into any great detail. Perhaps I could another time, but you can see it in terms of the money situation. Clarke came over, and he didn't re-involve himself in Fenianism. He was sent to do this. His farm in Mandeville, in Suffolk County, New York, was not failing. He'd increased it and took out citizenship just before he came back. Right? Why would you do that? It's the form of insurance policy. Kathleen Clarke, well-intentionedly, misrepresented that, but in her private correspondence revealed something that only came out about 10 years ago, that she knew exactly what her husband was doing. She actually probably knew more than she should have, actually, bearing in mind the seriousness of this. Something like $100,000 passed personally through Tom Clarke's hands. He didn't just end up with one business, he ended up with 3 shops in Dublin. One of which are at the top of O'Connell Street and Parnell Street, those of you who know Dublin City, that is looking at the Rotunda, where the public formation of Ogden Heron took place on the 25th of November 1913. Now, all the officerships had been decided before that. And by April 1916, every single county OC was a member of the IRB. And people who hadn't been beforehand, like Collivat and Limerick City, they were brought into the IRB. And I presume those who weren't prepared to do that were given their marching orders, no pun intended. And who was the man who gave them their directions and agreed on individual code terms with them? Pearse. So whilst the special branch agents of Dublin Castle were watching Tom Clarke's main shop night and day, and their records are quite interesting to see who's going into that shop, because they're stamped. That's the bit they let us see. All the county OCs were summoned to rural Rathfarnham, outside rural Rathfarnham, for a personal one-to-one conversation with Pádraig Pearse. So this man is not some sort of dilettante. He was a key military figure in the Irish Republican tradition. Now, without digressing too much, and I know I only have another hour or two, I want to say a little bit about that. You could do an entire module on Pádraig Pearse. I mean, there's a lot in this, lads. You know what I mean? Pearse was a key figure. And when the Howth and Kilcool gun running situation occurred, Cathal Brugha set off from the grounds of Scoilane, St. Enda's, with Mícheál Buachla, Donald Buachla's brother, who later became a senior civil engineer in Dublin Corporation. They left from St. Enda's with motorised transport to go down to Kilcool, which is south of Bray. It's on the way towards Wicklow town on the coast there. And the Kilcool beach is a good mile from Kilcool town. And Kilcool town, a lovely spot, is not exactly a metropolis. So it's on the ancient south route of Ireland, but this is a good place to bring in weaponry if you have motorised transport. And I mean in terms of motorboat and vehicles to take the weaponry, which they did. And Ireland being Ireland, the damn Charlotte Bank broke down down the downs, and they had to send a fleet of taxis out to sort of get the gear. Nothing was lost. In fact, in 1914, when I spoke at the gun running commemoration down there, it's in 1914. In 2014, when I spoke, unless I was there in spirit in a previous life, I was sitting down in one of the main pubs in the town where we had a reception after the talk and the march, right? As someone plonks a rifle in my hands, and I'm very interested in military history, so it was a great thing to have a hold of it. That was one of the rifles that they kept locally, right? They didn't all come up here. They didn't all go to Terranure. They weren't all used in 1916 or the Town War. So that was quite interesting, particularly I was sitting next beside the retired Garda sergeant. So anyway, I hope they wipe my prints off it. Kilcool, you wouldn't think of it, but it's very successful. Now, meanwhile, Pearse had been made essentially a staff officer within O'Glaheron. Now, I say O'Glaheron, here's why. In 1866, Irish American Fenians in the Buffalo area attacked into British North America, which led to the Federation of what we now know as Canada. And the Canadians have never thanked the IRB enough for getting them a country out of a state of provinces, right? And saving them from the Germans or the Russians or the Chinese or whatever was out of favour at that point in time. When they went again in 1867, the same year as the Fenian Uprising in this country, they went as the Irish Republican Army, and they had an IRA flag, they had IRA badges. The Fenian movement at war is the Irish Republican Army. So when they were formed publicly in the Rotunda at the top of O'Connell Street, in November 1913, the first term is O'Glaheron, and then in brackets you have Irish Volunteers, which doesn't mean O'Glaheron, right? The Irish doesn't translate well anyway to English. But what they're saying is we are actually the Irish Republican Army. And at that point in time, the IRB Supreme Council had intended to use this much broader organisation as a means to spearhead revolution in this country. So from the start, the IRB instrumental. There was a bit of temporising because the IPP under John Redmond, which had only reformed effectively in 1900, the IPP, even though it was factionalised, couldn't allow this separate entity represent national sentiment on a 30 county basis. So they did the old thing. If they can't control it, they'll try and destroy it. So they ended up forcing and splitting the committee by pushing out extra members into it. And people like Roger Casement and Bulmer Hobson, for well-intentioned purposes, went along with that. But from that point onwards, men like Clark and McDermott, the harder Revolutionary Corps, would have nothing to do with them. The net result was, in the summer of 1914, as the First World War, the plague of the so-called Great War, when that became encroached onto our society, thrown at us by Empire loyalists, the movement was very badly fractured. But that suited the IRB, because they didn't need 250,000 men. What they wanted was 10 or 15,000 men who could do the bidding of the Supreme Council of the IRB, and would, of course, control headquarters of O'Glaheron. So Pearse, in his early days, after himself and Casement had gone to Limerick to set up, by arrangement, the Limerick and Clare Volunteers, and people like Michael Brennan, who was a very distinguished IRA man during the Town War, they were all at that. They were all at that meeting in Limerick City, as arranged. It wasn't if I'm going down to Limerick and we're going to find a few fellows who are up for it. They knew exactly how to go about this. But there's a way in which you launch things publicly that speak to the ordinary person, the person you want to bring in from the cold to inspire and to mobilise and to train. So there are methodologies that were used in the 1910s, 1920s, which would be familiar to any of you who have any inkling of revolutionary activity. So Pearse went to America. You will read time and time again, this raised money for Scoilena. Well, that's partly true. That is partly true. He spoke on the 22nd of February at the Irish American Athletic Club in New York. The man who chaired that was Dan Spellacy, an Irishman. Now, Spellacy was chair of the Education Committee of the famous Irish American Athletic Club, which sponsored a number of Irish-born Olympic champions. But he's also treasurer of the Irish Volunteer Fund in New York City. So he's wearing more than one hat, and that can happen. People who join one organisation are quite likely, in some cases, to be a member of two. At this point, Pearse was a member of the IRB and indeed Old Heron, which was the same organisation, effectively at command level. On the 28th of February, he spoke in the famous Brooklyn Academy of Music. Very famous institution, BAM these days. If you get an initial, if you're known by an initial, you're pretty famous. You know what I mean? you don't have to say over there, the Brooklyn Academy of Music. And the governor of New York State, the Irish-American Martin Glynn, was there. 2,500 people were there. You couldn't get in. And it was a huge venue. Some of the worst weather in living memory. Dangerous levels of snow. Freezing conditions. And a standing room only. And everyone famous in the entire Eastern Seaboard was there. Old females who'd retired from Chicago were there. And this is where Pearse made fine allusions to the men of 1967 and others. I said you'll give you something about the reporters. This is from the Gaelic American. Gaelic American was the organ of Clan na Gael in New York, edited by the great John Devoy. John Devoy's protege was Tom Clark. And Tom Clark's two main proteges were Sean McDermott and Pádraig Pearse, in my opinion. So this is an account of Pearse in Philadelphia on the 17th of March, a day that features in the Irish calendar most years. And on Monday next, P.H. Pearse of St. Andrew's College, Dublin, will lecture in the Auditorium Parkway building on Broadway, right? His subject will be Irish education and the new volunteer force. Every time he spoke, it was, I'm going to talk about St. Enda's, and by the way, will you subscribe to the equipment fund of Old Heron? And we're not talking about stuff you need when you're hiking around the mountains, right? Mr. Pearse occupies a unique position in Ireland as an educationist, and in St. Enda's College, which he founded a few years ago, he puts his theories into practice. St. Enda's is the only school in Ireland that can be said to be really national in every department. It goes on like that. I mean, the Irish American press was very, very much on message. This is another account in the Gaelic American in May 1914. This is called the St. Enda's College Building Fund. So you're going to get subscriptions listed, much in the way that you would see in the United Irishman and on Fóblacht in the past, right? A letter from Pearse acknowledging donations, collected by the Irish American Club Philadelphia. Irish American Club Philadelphia, that's Clan na Gael headquarters. It's now in Jenkinstown, Philadelphia. In those days it was downtown. $1,000. It's a lot of money. John Quinn, New York, $100. Now, John Quinn was an Irish aesthete and very wealthy, multi-millionaire in New York City. John Quinn had partly bankrolled Pearse in America, and when Pearse was in America, he was writing for this, the Gaelic American, from the William Street offices of the Gaelic American, which was the open front of Clan na Gael in the city. Honourable Daniel F. Cohallan, New York. Cohallan was a Supreme Court Justice. He was the son of a Cork Fenian. He was a very influential figure, and he's a man who could straddle both the Democratic Party of New York, the anti-Tammany Hall wing, and the Republican Party. And he came within that close of getting an Irish Republic endorsed by the Republican Party at a convention in Chicago. It's just that people like Devoy and McGarity were not exactly on the same page about strategy. That's the only thing that really stopped that. So these are wealthy, effective people. Anyway, I'll just make that quick point. In his tour of the States, he was joined unexpectedly by Hobson. Pearse didn't know that Hobson was going to pursue him across the Atlantic. When Hobson found how successful Pearse was, he probably feared for his own position within the IRB Supreme Council, and rightly so, because there seemed to be a kernel of enmity between the two of them from that point onwards. And between 1912 and 1914, you have Pearse, Casement, Hobson, Thomas Ashe, and Dermot Lynch. Ashe and Dermot Lynch attended the biennial convention of Clan na Gael in Atlantic City, and they were there in the public capacity. Casement spoke to the convention in Norfolk, Virginia, of the Ancient Order of Hibernians. So you had the Ancient Order of Hibernians and avowed the Catholic fraternal organisation championing an Irish Protestant Republican. So as they should, as they should. So again, the terminology can be misleading at times in terms of what the motive forces actually are. Pearse met McGarity in Philadelphia, and when Case was in Philadelphia a few months from that point, he had the extraordinary experience of being there in July of 1914 when news of the Howth gun running came through. Now, the Howth gun running was buttressed by the attack by the King's Own Scottish Borderers on the crowd at Bachelor's Walk, which is very close to Connell Bridge, in our north side of Dublin City, on the Liffey. Shooting and bayoneting Irish men, women, and children, and I mean literally Irish men, women, and children, was not popular in Irish America. And the amount of money that this generated in the States is phenomenal. Thousands and thousands of dollars became available that there'd been no sign of it the previous day. You have a massive parade in downtown Philadelphia, a parade of coffins, protests, tens and tens of thousands of people protesting. And that also happened in New York and elsewhere. So very, very quickly, you have a quickening of pacing. Now, in New York, before Pearse left New York, he attended a meeting of the GAA in Celtic Park in Queens. That's the old Celtic Park, which is now built over. At that point, a former pupil and friend of his, Captain Michael Lonergan, of the Na Fianna Éireann and the Irish Brotherhood, paraded their regiment of the Irish Volunteers. Ógan na hÉireann were actually organised in New York and known as the Irish Volunteers before they were established in Dublin. Cumann had two groupings founded by Sidney Gifford, both of which came out of the Ladies' Ancient Order of Hibernians in New York City. So again, we tend not to think about that. Now, they're not necessarily going to be mobilised to fight the British. We know that. However, many of them were prepared to do so, and they certainly were standing foursquare behind the men and women on this side of the Atlantic. And that was significant and important. I'm going to move along. I mentioned the gun runnings in Howth and Kilcool. Pat McCartan went back over. Tom Ash had been there, ill-fated to die on hunger strike, sadly. And then on the 25th of June 1915, O'Donovan Rossa died. Now, O'Donovan Rossa made an extraordinary contribution to Irish history, but in death he provided a golden opportunity. Partly because his wife Mary fully understood the value of propaganda in the best sense of that particular term. Terence Balliol McManus's death had laid the foundation for the Republican plot in Glasnevin. Now you had a venue to bring people like O'Donovan Rossa, and a bit like that, it was done in some style, despite clerical opposition, which was understandable because they believed it to be sacrilegious and dangerous supporting secular Republicans. So the speech given by Pearse at the grave of O'Donovan Rossa is rightly famous, but he basically declared war in England. But he did so uniformed as a senior officer of Ógan na hÉireann and filmed by Pathé News, but also by Clan Gael. So there's a huge added value to these events, and they're used for fundraising. They're used for spreading the word. And when you see the level of paramilitary organisation on display, or military organisation, we can call it that, at that particular funeral, much of which was organised by Ned Daly of Limerick City, incidentally, who was later to Tom Clark by marriage, you get a sense of a major movement. The Fianna Éireann were there, Cumann were there, the Volunteers were there, the Irish Citizen Army was there. All the players you would expect and perhaps hope for to be engaged in national sort of affirmation heard Pearse basically declare war on the British Empire. Now, this is during wartime. The Redmondites had split the volunteer movement in August, September of 1914. About 30,000 of them had gone into the various Irish regiments of the Imperial Forces, many of whom never to return. The vast majority of them simply went home. The National Volunteers, as they were known, went into terminal decline, and the rump of the Ógan na hÉireann, the Irish Volunteers, still called that in English, became increasingly distilled towards a revolutionary pathway. And this is why, of course, in 1916 came on. They've been actively planning for that. In January 1916, there was a worry that the ICA, due to the bellicose statements of James Connolly, might have a home run, just go for it anyway. There was no prospect whatsoever of the Irish Citizen Army due to their size, armed trade unions. There was no prospect of them militarily prevailing, but they could have made a significant stunt, possibly at considerable personal cost. And certainly, almost certainly, can't say it for sure, very likely resulting in the arrest and execution of Connolly if he survived it. So at this point, it became necessary to bring the Irish Citizen Army into the inner councils of the IRB, element that were planning actively for a rising. Now again, without digressing too much, the IRB believed that the best time to attack the British was during wartime. And they'd missed a trick during the Boer War, when the British appeared to be much more vulnerable than you would think for a global empire. The Irish Americans were firmly of that view. And people like McGarty and Devoy and J.T. Keating and others who are more obscure, Captain Ryan and Buffalo and others, other high-level Milton Fenians, they wanted their Irish annex to strike during wartime. But they had to do it before America during the war, because otherwise America couldn't support the Irish Republic, because you'd have a division within the Allied forces against the Axis. So the timing was of an essence here. Now this is in the run-up to the disastrous Battle of the Somme. So just as the Battle of the Somme was being prepared, and everyone knew there'd be some form of major offensive in the good weather, the decision was taken, we better act because Congress looks as if it may endorse a proposal that the United States of America would enter the war in Europe. Now they didn't until April 1917. But prior to that, they were providing money and war material, and actually America was moving from a minor power status to a major power status, later a superpower. But that was later. But you had to strike before they did anything, because that's where the logistics train went, and that is where the political support could be garnered. If you were lucky, powers could recognise an Irish Republic. But they're fickle, and they're up to the necks in the war, which they suffered horrendously. You might be lucky if Berlin recognised the Irish Republic, and I never to this day understand why they didn't do that, even for the sheer devilment of it, right? I mean, they were helping out, but all they do is recognise the damn Irish Republic. But it would have been better if Berlin and Paris and DC did, because in that eventuality, you don't have to defeat the British Army in detail in the cities and the fields of Ireland. You can declare the Republic and have it recognised. Contrary to what we've all been told in school, the basic strategy was to rise in Dublin City, to have a series of other armed showings that would tie down reinforcements to provide about 48 hours window for other countries to recognise the declared Irish Republic. In two sentences, that's what it was about. There was never, ever, ever any intention that 15, 20,000 volunteers, who at that point didn't have equipment to fight, would be able to defeat the British Empire. And there's a viewpoint that rather than the British being weak during the wartime, the exigencies of their multi-fronted war would oblige them to be ruthless. And it was raised in 1916 that poison gas be used against the army of the Republic. That was literally raised and considered. And there's people who are in favour of that, not for the first or last time. In fact, there's people in this room who were gassed under different circumstances. But I'll park that one for now. So the strategy was hold out for 2 days, have the Republic recognised. Pearse is acknowledged to have written most of the 1916 Proclamation, which is a thoroughly astounding document. But before I do that, and I'm going to finish up in a few minutes because there's only so much I can say that makes any sense in a warm room such as this, right? I mentioned Pearse's speeches, and normally you'd hear an extract from the 1st of August 1915, the grave of Donna Marassa, and I have often read it. I give it to my students every year. But I'm going to do something different. I'm going to read you a short excerpt of what he said in New York in 1914, after I get this thing done. This is where he started. This is in May 1914. We who speak here tonight are the voice of one of the ancient indestructible things of the world. We the voice of an idea which is older than any empire and will outlast every empire. We and ours, the inheritors of that idea, have been an age-long war with one of the most powerful empires that has ever been built up upon the earth. And that empire will pass before we pass. We are older than England, and we are stronger than England. In every generation we renew the struggle, and so it shall be unto the end. When England thinks she has trampled out our battle in blood, some brave man rises and rallies us again. When England thinks she has purchased us with a bribe, some good man redeems us by a sacrifice. Wherever England goes on a mission of empire, we meet her and we will strike at her. Yesterday, as it was in South African Veldt, today it is in the Senate House at Washington, tomorrow it may be in the streets of Dublin. We pursue her like a sleuth hound. We lie in wait for her and come upon her like a thief in the night, and someday we will overwhelm her with the wrath of God. That's oratory, man. You know what I mean? And he did this all the time. And you can see the echo of what became the 19th Proclamation of some of that. The concept of a rising every generation seems extremely important in Fenian ideology. The idea is basically this. if our people are right and they are wrong, we will always be right and they will always be wrong. So even if the quest for self-determination and national democracy is frustrated, it is still the right course of action. And as long as people are prepared to rise again, as Emmet did, as Young Ireland did, as the Fenians did, as the Dynamiters of the 1880s did, as long as people are prepared to do that, we cannot be defeated. And this is why the Fenians identified with the symbol, the personification of Emmet, but also the symbol of the phoenix. It's indestructible because it's the right thing. And it will prevail. And it has to prevail. And it shall prevail. And Pearse was absolutely telling everyone, this is what we're doing. And he reiterated that during the wartime circumstances at Glasnevin in August 1915. And they delivered that on the 24th of April 1916 with the Declaration of the Irish Republic. Now, if I was going to be a little bit pedantic for a second, and historians are meant to be, the Republic had been declared on the 23rd of July 1803. It had been declared on St. Patrick's Day in 1867, and it was redeclared on the 24th of April 1915. So the Republic was, people laugh at this, virtually achieved. In other words, it's a real concept for people who cared about such matters, which admittedly would have been in public the minority of Irish people, but that's the revolutionary vanguard. No one's going to vote themselves into revolution. You have to take it and have it endorsed. And if you're unworthy, you will not be endorsed, and then it should not have been. So it would right itself. But it is correct. You strike, and the people get behind you. And in 1917, that's exactly what happened in the Empire of Russia. So this isn't pie in the sky. There are precedents for extraordinary action being driven by people who are determined and ideological and focused and willing to die and, yes, to kill for it, because you have to. They will kill you. Their whole structure is military and paramilitary. That is the nature of empires. And, those who take on empires need to pay them in their own damn coin, otherwise you will fail. Now, this is the Sovereign People. This is a reprint, obviously. This is the last major published document by Pearse in March, 31st of March 1916. And I'm going to read just the first sentence or two. National independence involves national sovereignty. National sovereignty is twofold in its nature. It is both internal and external. It implies the sovereignty of the nation over all its parts, over all men and things within the nation, and it implies the sovereignty of the nation as against all other nations. Nationality is a spiritual fact, but nationhood includes her physical freedom and physical power in order of the maintenance of physical freedom, as well as the spiritual fact of nationality. Bit of a mouthful, but Pearse was deeply invested in the ideology of these things. And here's the last sentence. At the end of the former essay, I set that prophecy of Mitchell's as to the coming of a time when the kindred and tongues and nations of the earth, as a quote from Robert Emmet, should give their banners to the wind, and his prayer that he, John Mitchell, might live to see it, and that on that great day of the Lord he might have breath and strength enough to stand on Ireland's immortal green. John Mitchell did not live to see it. He died, an old man, 40 years before its dawning. But the day of the Lord is here, and you and I have lived to see it. And we are young, and God has given us strength and courage and counsel. May he give us victory. This is Pearse. You know what I mean? So I'm not going to give you a full account of the rising. This is not the occasion for that. I'm really talking about Pearse's role. The 16th Proclamation, which is readily available online, and I'm sure you've all read it at some point.
There's a copy on that.
Oh, of course. That's right. There's one right here. Yeah, and I forgot my screwdriver, so I can't bring it home with me. Some idiot suggests, I shouldn't say that. It has been suggested that Pearse did not read the proclamation on the 24th of April 1916. And then there's this fake argument, well, this doesn't have steps. Well, actually, there was a step up, but that's not where he read it. He read it the portico of the GPO. So let me just, in case you're curious about that, let me just give you something on that here. This is an eyewitness account, if I can find it. And I'll finish up in a few minutes, take some questions from you, as long as they're easy ones. Yeah. Hang on, I actually used two direct quotes from participants. This is from Brennan Whitmore, who was a very unusual Wexford-based commandant who fought in Dublin City instead of his designated battalion in Wexford. Anyway, he fought. The front door was opened and Pearse and Connolly, with a small escort, passed outside. Pearse read out the proclamation and then had it posted up publicly. The crowd kept its distance respectfully enough until the little party had passed back into the building when a rush was made to read the notice. Those in the rear called on those in the front to read it aloud. Many sentences were loudly cheered, and at the end there was a great ovation. Now you won't see that in your school books. And there's many similar accounts. I think I found 7 or 8 first-hand accounts of Pearse doing this. He also read the address to the citizens of Dublin. Now, very shortly, the United Irishman Directory in 1803 had 4 men. Robert Emmet was the chairman. He was effectively the chief of staff of the United Irishman. But there was 3 other men, all of whom survived, which is why you never heard about them, and 2 escaped to America and joined the American Army. One of them was Philip Long. Now, Philip Long wrote an address to the citizens of Dublin. So there's 2 proclamations in 1803, and there's 2 in 1916 as well. So Pearse was determined to show the connectivity, the ideological continuity from Ogden O'Haran back to the United Irishman, which of course is entirely valid, because that was indeed a real thing. So let me just see, can I find that? It doesn't look like I'm going to, does it? Yeah, page 2 on that, yeah, okay. Okay, this is the Citizens of Dublin, so the same title as that of 03. Ireland's honour has already been redeemed. It remains to vindicate her wisdom and her self-control. All citizens of Dublin who believe in the right of their country to be free will give their allegiance and their loyal help to the Irish Republic. There is work for everyone, for the men in the fighting line and for the women in the provision of food and first aid. Such looting has already occurred, has been done by the hangers-on of the British Army, swines. Ireland must keep her new honour unsmirched. We have lived to see an Irish Republic proclaimed. May we live to establish it firmly, and may our children and our children's children enjoy the happiness and prosperity which freedom will bring. So more pretty stirring rhetoric, but this is not just erudite ramblings. This is a revolution in progress. When they held on for 6 days, they felt very vindicated. And if you think about it, whilst the headquarters unit had to retreat from the GPO to Moore Street, currently under dire threat from progress and capitalism, great, thanks very much for that. When that was certainly had to be evacuated when it was in flames. When that occurred, they had already held out for 4 days longer than they expected. They were expecting massed infantry attacks to overwhelm them, like something like the Western Front, an urban versus the Western Front. Well, that was attempted in the South Dublin Union, and the British soldiers who attacked were driven back with massive loss by people like Cathal Brugha and Con Colbert, etc. So hence the suggestion that gas might be used against Irish forces in a civilian zone that had not been evacuated. Martial law had been declared, but the civilians were not evacuated, and the legitimate policing force, the DMP, had withdrawn from the scene, and the Royal Irish Constabulary were afraid to show up, because basically speaking, the IRA would have made hames of them, and they did, as they did by 1920. So I'm just going to finish off by trying to find you one more. Yeah, this is a good one. During the retreat from the GPO, Pearse organised the rearguard. There is this ridiculous idea, and I have to be honest with you. Winifred Carney was a fantastic and brave, courageous, effective woman. But her account of Pearse the GPO is simply not true, and it's not borne out by other people. I think her deep loyalty to Connolly clouded some reversion. Pearse was frequently outside the GPO. He wasn't cloistered in some back office writing stuff all the time. He only wrote one major document. Connolly also wrote numerous documents, and she would have known because she typed them, right? And over saw them being typed. Pearse was on the battlements, which is the most exposed part of the GPO, and he was lucky not to share the fate of Connolly. He's lucky to escape being badly wounded. But during the retreat through the lanes around Moore Lane back to the Moore Street Terrace, as this has been highlighted, here's what the Burqa of the Rathfarnham Company were called. Now remember, the Rathfarnham Company was E Company of the 4th Battalion. These are Pearse's guys. So he was there with people he trained and was in charge of, not just at a command level, but at a unit level. The street was being swept by machine gun fire from Mary Street direction. We had to make a dash across in 1s and 2s into Henry Lane. Bulfin made the journey with great speed. My turn was next. I could see the bullets like hailstones hopping on the streets, and I thought that would be a miracle to get to the other side scatheless. With head down as if running against heavy rain, I ran as I never ran before or since. Now, Pearse was in charge of the rearguard. He had also directed counter-sniper fire, and amongst the guys he was directing was Don LaBoucle, the man he represented in court, who was known privately as the GPO sniper, and very probably killed more British soldiers than anyone else in 1916. He was very probably one of the most effective volunteers the Irish Republican Army ever had. Well, as is well known, by the 29th of April, the mortal threat to civilians, which had been witnessed daily and hourly, in fact, became such that it was deemed to be unethical to prolong a situation that could not lead to short-term military victory. So at 3:45 in the afternoon, parlayed by the very, very brave Elizabeth Farrell, the terms were, well, the surrender was agreed with General Lowe. It took more than another day to convince the other outposts to stand down. And it took a delegation from Wexford, the successful rising in Wexford, to attempt to meet both Pearse and Connolly to convince them that no, we've decided to go in a different direction for the time being. Now, Pearse was treated relatively well. He had no complaints. His demeanour was very positive. He knew he was going to be executed. He made a request that he be the only one executed. But that, of course, was not acceded to. And there is a sad personal tragedy that he may not have realised his brother would be executed. And there's clear signs that he didn't realise that Willie Pearse was not only under the sentence of death, but was going to be shot. Now, General Maxwell had made logistic preparations to bury 200 Irishmen in quicklime. He was stopped by Sir Alfred Bucknell, the Judge Advocate General, who came over from London to oversee the legal aftermath of what they knew was going to be a successful conclusion from their point of view to our rising. On the 2nd of May in Richmond Barracks, there was a court-martial. Pearse, who was prisoner number 1, was sentenced to death, as indeed was Tom Clark and Tomás MacDonagh. And they were shot in the early hours of the 3rd of May. And contrary to the Articles of War, military legislation, their bodies were removed from the place of execution, put in a truck. Their eyes were not taped, their wounds were not concealed, driven across the Liffey up to Arbor Hill Barracks and returned in a quicklime grave. Now, I'll say this to British authorities, I will say this, they did note where the bodies were located, so the remains were identifiable subsequently. However, that was against military law. They'd been shot in the middle of the night in the Stonebreakers Yard, chosen because it could not be overseen from other cells. This had an unsettling effect on the population in Dublin, particularly when there was further volleys heard in the night the following day and the subsequent days. Well, let's put it this way. If the British had intended to intimidate Irish men and Irish women and to sap the will of the people, the greater part of the people, to achieve self-determination and common decency in their lifetime, and to secure the future for their children and their families, if that's what they intended by this mode of activity, it spectacularly misfired. Spectacularly. And when the vote was much expanded, famously, and you have the elections of December 1918, you have an overwhelming popular vote for the Irish Republic. Not for Home Rule, for a 32-county Irish Sovereign Republic. That was the mandate. It was received then, and has never been acceded to by Westminster. It doesn't mean it won't happen. Of course it will happen. But it could have been and should have been conceded in December 1918. And that, of course, is the legacy of the organisations of that time, in which Pádraig Pearse played, I would say, a very important and a role of integrity. Thank you.